Good morning and welcome to the experience here on ESPN LA 710. I'm Lafern Cusack. If you have any show ideas or comments or questions about this show, or you would like to suggest some shows, feel free to log on to espnla.com and go to the radio page and shoot us an email, or check me out on Twitter at Lafern Cusack. Today we're talking discipline. How far can we go, or what can we do to change what discipline is in our families? And I'm speaking with Kem Saunders. He's a licensed marriage and family therapist, and he is trained in trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy and managing and adaptive practice therapy. Welcome to the show, Kem.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having me.
So tell us a little bit about your background and your experience.
Well, I'm pretty much a product of the inner city. Grew up pretty much in a single-parent home. I was supported throughout my life by my extended family and the communities that I lived in, and as a result, I've been really impressed with those people who help children. And I think subconsciously, from the age of around 10, I've always been drawn to the helping profession or helping others in some capacity or another. I'm a graduate of Kent State University, undergraduate and graduate school. My master's is in community counseling. My undergraduate degree is in Pan-African Studies. I'm a member of Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity Incorporated.
All right.
Yeah. And, I've been in the helping profession for about 17 years.
And that's something that you gravitate towards because you see what the community needs?
Yeah, well, I guess I noticed what the community was lacking. And that was, a very strong representation of men in general. Most of the communities that I came from were pretty much heavily dominated by women, and some of them were raising little boys and had some real struggles. Some of the programs that were developed, some of the educational programs that were developed were all pretty much facilitated by women. And so I noticed that there was an extremely low amount of men participating in some key aspects of human development. And that's drew me to the conclusion that maybe I should be used as a vessel in that area. Yeah.
Very interesting. So the women in your community were organizing and creating these programs that may not fit towards the male population?
Well, they did the best that they could. But let's say, for instance, if we had a population of children, all females, who wanted to understand what it meant to have a baby, and you had a very informed male, and you had a very informed female, odds are the female may have a little more information on that particular topic, because there's some idiosyncrasies there that a male, no matter how much he would like to help in that area or explain that, he just can't do it. Very similar to the females in the community, there was some real good programs developed for, personal development and goal setting and understanding how to channel energy. But to some degree, because they weren't male, they just didn't have the capacity in certain areas to try to really engage those boys, which led to them being described as oppositional, difficult to deal with, not being able to adhere to structure. And when that male component was at it, there was this slight pause that was taken, where the male said, well, maybe what we need to do is recognize that this is a very energetic kid, and we have to find some ways to channel that, and we have to find some ways to engage him. Let me take over from here. And just through the simple interaction of those two males, it's kind of something that I really can't explain. A young male and an older male, there's a kind of connectedness that is just kind of a spiritual thing. But as a result, if you look at that relationship over time, you notice that on a consistent basis, these boys' behaviors changed. some of the concerns that these females had and frustrations that they had through all of the programs that they tended to try and developed, those concerns were being addressed. But so much easier now. Mm-hmm. And you have to consider it was because of the male presence.
What do you say to people that say, you know, I am a single mother doing the best that I can, mm-hmm. and I know what's right for my child, mm-hmm. and I expose my child to a lot of things that have some sort of male attribute or can address those needs that you were talking about?
Well, first of all, I'd probably say, well, maybe you're right. You know, it is your child. You know, but that's why I said we'd have to consider that the male presence had some impact. There is no absolute right or wrong answer when you're dealing with human beings. But I think it's extremely damaging to a child if the caregiver says, I've cornered the market on raising my child simply because it's my child.
I'm an expert.
Right. I think you might want to consider that there have been other people who have raised children, single parents, couples, who have had successes and failures. And as long as we keep our eyes, ears, and hearts open, odds are there's some information that we can benefit from to help us to deal with our child. Because if your child is having a problem, and you're the parent who knows what's best for your child, and the problem hasn't ended, then that suggests that you may need to take in some more information, along with what you may be using that's pretty good.
Yes, there's also the fact how the more things that you expose your child to or your children to, yeah. the more vast their brain, the more vast their development and learning. Mm-hmm. And some people say, okay, well, I have this male child and I want to raise him to be a strong male child, and so yeah. I have a son like you said,
yeah,
or like you know. So my son, he was doing something and all the boys roughed house with him, and he cried a little bit because he was scared. He wasn't used to that. And I was like, oh, it's okay. Come here, baby. You guys be careful.
Right.
And my friend said, Lafern, you can't baby him. He needs to get rough. Yeah. And it was like, oh, wait a minute. You know, what is that?
Yeah.
And is it like the male version of, okay, we need to rough house with this boy because he's all rough and tumble? Or is it... I mean, I don't
well,
know.
Some of it's conditioning, some of it's socialization, some of it's polluted conditioning, some of it's polluted socialization, and some of it's healthy on both of those aspects, in both of those wises. But the question becomes, what are you trying to socialize your child to become?
A strong man.
Okay. Does a strong man consist of being angry? Does a strong man consist of being rough and physical? Or does a strong man consist of having the intellectual capabilities to be able to recognize when it's time to be tough and when it's time to chill out? You know what I mean? Because I don't mind raising a child to be a strong man, but I would also like to raise a gentleman. You know, I don't mind raising a woman to be a very caring, nurturing woman, but I would also like to raise a woman that can recognize when you're in an abusive relationship, when the boundaries for fundamental respect for humanity have been crossed. And some people have conditioned women to accept unhealthy behavior, and they categorize it as, well, you're just being a good woman. Well, I beg to differ. You know, I think there's a balance between those two worlds, and what we as a society need to do more of is wrestle with trying to understand that balance. I think males on occasion have been conditioned to be disrespectful of women because that's what it means to be a man. There have been people in my setting and in my community who have said that the more women you have, the more man you are. Mm. Never mind that this girl is somebody's daughter. Mm-hmm. This girl could be somebody's mother eventually. This girl could grow up to be someone's grandmother. So if there's a certain level of respect that those populations of women deserve, she's a part of that same gender. So how do you validate the conquering of women and say that that's what it means to be a man? There's a contradiction there. And so that's where the wrestling needs to take place a little more.
But when you're in a family and you're thinking of how you were raised and how you grew up and how you know how to discipline your child, or you continue those type of unhealthy relationships or thinking and incorporate that into your own family and raising your kids because that's what you know. How do you know to step away from that?
Well, I'll answer that two ways. Unhealthy is the operative word there. And I think that we really need to be mindful of family practices that are both healthy and unhealthy, or family practices that may be perceived as unhealthy by others, but may be healthy to the family or to that indigenous culture. For instance, Asian women have a very strict way of raising their children. No video games, studying for long hours, no social activities. And this is a generalization, but it's an article that I read. They don't want them studying music. Another culture or another person on the outside of that could easily deem that neglectful parenting. It depends on who you ask. It depends on the perspective. It depends on how that child eventually becomes socialized. There's a lot of variables. There are some parenting styles that are abusive. Period. There are some parenting styles that are perceived as abusive but may not be. For instance, we are all familiar with what's happening with Adrian Peterson right now. But Adrian Peterson, I think we should consider that this is a human being that comes from a particular community. And some of the parenting practices he learned, like he said, he grew up with those experiences. I think it would be great for us to continue to flush that out, to find out if there's ways we could have educated him more about the society we live in today and find ways to marry some of his familial traditions with the ways of society so that he didn't necessarily put himself in a situation where he's trying to find a way to wrestle through those two systems. I don't necessarily make it a point to comment about what is considered abuse unless it's pretty clear that I have enough information to make that call. I really don't. If a person is spanking a person open hand, everybody pretty much has accepted that that's an okay form of punishment. But let's wrestle with timeouts for a minute, okay?
Let's do it. Break it down, Kem.
Timeouts. That's where you put your child in a corner or an isolated space, and you say, I'm going to separate you from the behavior and give you a chance to kind of think it through, and then we're going to come back. That intervention became so popular that now it's been identified as the most appropriate way to raise one's children. I totally disagree. Why do I disagree? Well, one, from an African American perspective, we engage our children. We look at them, we talk to them, we work through the issue with them. We don't separate our children and put them in a corner and have them to process it alone. But let's say, for instance, the same system that pushed the time out now pushes the definitions of abuse. And now in this society, the other populations who are living in that society had nothing to do with the development of it. What is abuse if Caucasian Americans developed all of the guidelines? You didn't have any indigenous people there who had the same credentials, any African Americans there who had the same credentials, any Persian Americans who have the same credentials. Now they're disciplining their child. Under those guidelines, each one of those populations could be on trial for abuse. So the wrestling with that becomes when we start defining what is law, what is most appropriate practices for children as far as parenting. it's best to have as many representatives of those different populations in the panel that develops those criteria.
Right. And a lot of the programs, like you were discussing earlier, they don't encompass different cultures or different ways of thinking, and that's why a lot of them fail. Right.
You're absolutely right, because you're talking about what children are familiar with. When you make a child comfortable because they're familiar, their level of engagement increases tenfold. It's attractive to them. But if you put, like, let's use the example of the little boy who was being berated, to use your words, by his father. He hadn't even been socialized appropriately to be prepared for that.
So there was a baseball game, a softball game. A father was yelling at his son to hit the ball. Come on, you can do it. And the father was so intense, the kid was paralyzed. And he could not do it, and he struck out. And he was in tears in the dugout, and he couldn't be consoled at all. And for me, that's like, this guy can't even see what he's doing to his child, but he wants his son to, hit the ball out of the field or whatever.
And in the clinical profession, we have what's called a responsibility pie. And I want to use that analogy for the listeners. As we know, with a piece of pie or a whole pie, there are several pieces. But in the clinical profession, we use the responsibility pie to assist a client with understanding what they're responsible for and what others may be responsible for, because sometimes they may take responsibility for something that someone else should be taking responsibility for. Let's go with the baseball incident. The son could possibly be taking responsibility for that whole incident and say, I'm a failure, I'll never be anything, I'll never be able to perform under pressure. All of these things, because at the end of the day, that's what took place in that setting. But I would say, well, that's an interesting way to look at it, but do you think your dad had any responsibility in that because of the way that he was yelling and, was kind of not really supporting you in a way that was comfortable to you? And if so, how much of that pie? And if he says, well, maybe I should have half and then dad should have half, I'll be like, wow, that's fantastic. You're able to recognize that you're not solely responsible for the way that took place. And I'll say, well, let's go a little further. What about all of those people that were kind of laughing at you when you struck out? Do you think they have anything to do with the way that you felt? And he'll say, well, maybe I'll give them a little piece too, because if I was in that situation, I would go and support my friend. And I'll say, wow. So now the pie is separated in a way that you're not really responsible for all of the things that took place. And I'll show them the picture of the pie. I'll say, see, your slice is so much smaller now. Initially, it was a whole pie. And to the child, that is like so, I guess, refreshing to hear. And it's actually empowering. And they'll use that same way of thinking in every interaction after that.
Just that quickly? Yes.
And you can also share it with the father.
Isn't that harder to do?
Well, of course.
A grown man changing his, hey, that's my son, he's not going to be.
Sure, that's hard, but what's most disarming is when you come to a parent with saying, listen, I understand that you love your child. That's not even up for debate. It's quite clear. So let's not even waste valuable time trying to argue that. All I'm trying to do is try to get you to consider. Because all a therapist does is plant seeds. At the end of the day, the person that you're talking to has to make the choice to accept the information as valid. Because we also use a technique called the cognitive triangle. That's when thoughts, feelings, and behaviors are always connected and they impact each other, whether it's a thought or an event or a feeling. There's no way that triangle is not connected. And so if the father can't recognize that his feelings are creating a certain behavior in him, then there's nothing that I can do. It's called communication It's called relationship. Those are the two key aspects of therapy. If the father's not willing to engage me in that kind of communication and relationship, then he's just basically saying, I want to continue to treat my child a certain way, and I'm just not open. But that's not good parenting.
There is a difference when what you're talking about, how you have a person who something happens and it's an immediate reaction instead of a thought process. I know how I think and feel is something happens, I internalize it, I run it through my whole body to get I analyze what's going on in the situation, and then I come up with a conclusion, not an immediate reaction to something.
You might not think you're having an immediate reaction, but your internalization is a reaction. That's what I mean. I Skyped my mom, who has diabetes, and when we finally got connected, I noticed two 2-liter bottles of Pepsi. And my mother's a diabetic. So my first thought was, my mother is doing something to harm herself. My first feeling was anger. My first behavior was to hang up on my mom after I said, I can't believe you're harming yourself. Thought, feeling, behavior based on information. My mom called me back, gave me more information, and it changed my thought, feeling, and behavior. What was the information she gave me? She said, Kim, could you Skype me back, please? I said, sure, Mom, because I am a respectful son. When I Skype her back, there's a young lady there. She said, Kim, this is Jenny. She went to the restroom for a minute and asked me could she place her groceries on my table. These are her sodas. She said, yes, I'm sorry for the confusion. So now my thought was, wow. I rushed to judgment. My feeling was total sadness. My behavior was apology, apology, apology. Now, I had that same internal dialogue that you had inside, but there still was a thought, feeling, and behavior connected to it. And that's why I was amplifying that idea, because even though you process it inside, even processing it inside is a behavior that is impacted by a thought.
Right. And the way to come out of it is communicating to understand more than what you just see, because there's always another story behind.
There's always more information.
Yeah, more information.
There's always more information. And if that dad says, this is my son, the information I have I got from my dad, and it worked for me, and that's what I'm going to use for my son, I'll say, okay, well, is there anything that you wish you could have gotten from another source that may have helped your dad raise you? And odds are, people will say, yes, I wish I would have learned more about how to apply for colleges, because my dad was great at teaching me sports and all of that stuff, but he had absolutely no understanding of how to deal with the collegiate system, how to assist me with going to the school that was the best in what I wanted to be a professional in. I say, then that analogy applies here. You may have some great information to give your son based on what you know. But wouldn't you want some more information to give your son based on what he may want? I don't get much arguments from him.
This is ESPN. Kem, so you are you have a certification in trauma, behavioral, and managing adaptive practices.
Yeah.
Tell us exactly what that means and how you relate it to the clients you have.
Well, trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy it's based on all of this scientific research from clinicians all over the world, and they developed a national certification board to eventually become certified in it. And what the criteria is you have to identify a client who's been traumatized in some way, shape, or form, and there's a criteria for trauma. And once you identify a client who has been traumatized, then you take them through this clinical model. And the clinical model consists of, think of the word practice. P represents psychoeducation. The R represents relaxation. The A represents affect modulation, which means feelings identification. The other C represents cognitive coping. The T represents the trauma narrative, when they actually write their trauma down, draw a picture of their trauma, or even have me write it down. Because the theory is that the more you talk about the trauma in its exact words, the more you're lifting the emotional burden. The other C represents cognitive coping, ways to think about the trauma in different ways now. Then you get to the E, which is exposure, going back to that family, that traumatic experience, and actually putting yourself in those situations and seeing how you respond now that you have your bag of tricks of understanding what a trauma is, because I've explained it through the psychoeducation model. You're using your relaxation techniques now that you've been given the information about how to use relaxation, like belly breathing, guided imagery. You're using your feelings identification, so you're able to recognize when I get in traumatic situations, my hands start to sweat.
Oh,
yeah. And you share all of this stuff with your parents.
Mm-hmm.
You share the entire model with your parents. You teach your parents how to support you with your relaxation, with your feelings identification. And you share the narrative with them. And the goal is to take them through these 8 or 9 steps in 4 to 6 weeks per module. And at the end, the theory is because they've had a chance to process with all of that information, they're better. I had to submit a tape to the National Certification Board of me actually going through the model with them. I had to give a clinical presentation of the client.
Oh, wow.
And then I had to wait on a return response of my tape. And after they certified me, I was able to go on and continue to practice it that way.
So do your clients come to you?
Yeah.
Or are they, or do other authorities say, okay, this person really needs your help or guidance?
Well, in any clinical setting, when a client comes in, whether they're referred by the school or the family just walks in because they want their child to receive services because there was a trauma in the family, after that referral is read, then they go through an assessment process, and the assessment process takes about 30 to 60 days. And that's where you just gather all kinds of historic information, from whether or not they received services before, to what kind of family setting they grew up in, and to detailed information about the trauma.
Mm-hmm.
And then based on that, or if it's not a trauma, then they go in another clinical model. And once they're identified as a child that could benefit from the trauma-focused CBT model, then they're referred to me.
Okay.
And based on that, that's when I move them through the model.
So if a child or a family has some sort of traumatic instance that happened,
Yeah.
what happens if those people, or a child or mom or dad or whomever, if they suppress that and don't talk about it, or don't get some sort of help in engaging what is happening with them or what has happened to them?
You mean what happens if the parent doesn't address the trauma, or the child? Or both?
Both.
Well, what happens is there's some behavioral indicators that start to show up. Like a kid who's been traumatized typically will have trouble sleeping, won't eat, or will overeat. Academics may suffer. There may be some enuresis, bedwetting. There may be some fear of being separated from parents. So if a parent decides not to address the trauma, all of these behavioral indicators could begin to manifest themselves, and their children won't succeed in the academic setting, in the community setting, in social settings. I'll give you an example. A father of 2 of the clients I had, he took his children on a camping trip, dived off a rock, broke his neck. One of the children witnessed the actual breaking of the neck. The other child witnessed them transferring their father off the mountains by way of helicopter. The children were having extremely difficult issues. In the midst of this healing process that the father was going through, his wife decided to leave him. His wife of 17 years.
Wow.
And so he was more focused on the marriage and less focused on how the witnessing of him being almost killed was impacting his children. So what I had to do was provide psychoeducation to him around the fact that both of those are traumas. But we have to find a way to address the trauma that is specifically related to the children. Because he came in because his daughter was refusing to sleep alone. His son, who was a straight A student, was now getting all S. And he wanted to try to find out what those behaviors were connected to. And once I provided the necessary information to him to help him to shift the focus from the separation between him and his wife, because he was, in a sense, almost taking over the therapy sessions.
Oh, wow.
But once I helped him to understand the structure that needed to take place in order for his children to get back to what he was hoping they'd get back to, he fully engaged, was fully invested. Both of his children successfully went through the model. And I'm happy to say they'll be actually graduating in 2 weeks from therapy.
That's great.
And the oldest son's grades are back up. He's taking college courses while in high school. The daughter is doing exceptionally well. She's drawing again, playing instruments. And dad is in his own therapy, dealing with the couple's related issues. And he's able to use the model to support the children as far as reminding them of their relaxation exercises, reminding them of their feelings identification, and reminding them to use what they learned in therapy if other trauma events occur. So yeah, that's how it works.
Skill-based.
Yeah, it's totally skill-based.
Yeah. And that education is with you for life.
Yeah. The human being is
resilient.
But we also are like sponges. The information we get in the first grade, we don't forget it when we go to the second grade. We still have that first grade information. And information we get when we have a negative experience and we learn how to cope with that, we don't not use those same coping mechanisms when we have another traumatic experience. That's our bag of tricks. That's our emotional bag of tricks, yeah.
Now, we discussed how some kids may have some sort of hyperactivity going on, or ways that they are coping with some sort of traumatic behavior.
Yeah.
A lot of kids are labeled ADHD, or some people are saying, "Oh, that's not a real, diagnosis," and all of that other stuff.
Yeah.
Some people use sports to help a child with their aggression or their learning, or getting the sillies out,
Yeah.
What do you do with that? Or do you use sports in a way? Or
I think sports is an excellent intervention to deal with someone who has a lot of energy. And I don't necessarily there are two different schools of thought about the ADHD diagnosis. One is that it's being overly diagnosed and it's really helping pharmaceutical companies to get rich. The other one is that, there are some children who are hyper, but you don't necessarily need to use medication. You can use sports. You can use their interest. You can identify activities that'll bring them down to baseline. Because all you're really trying to do is bring them down to a place where they'll be able to take in information in a healthy and appropriate way. Sometimes all you need to do is make them do 10 push-ups. Sometimes all you need to do is suggest that they add 10 push-ups to their ritual every day. Because a part of the clinical profession is also recognizing that every human being has a particular set of rituals that help them to function at their best.
Yes.
For instance, I'm a pretty calm person, but I may need a little push to get myself going. So in the morning, after I do my hygiene-related stuff, I'll put on something that is going to make me understand the importance of getting up and functioning at a high level, whether it's information about my history, information about my family, reading a poem of my father's, but that propels me into a certain energy field where I'm able to engage, I'm able to take in information, I'm able to impact the world. The same with a hyper kid. Let's say, for instance, he's running all over the place and you're trying to get him to learn. Or maybe there's 3 steps that you should take prior to trying to get him to learn. Okay, you want to run? Let's run for 20 minutes. You want to run? Let's run for 25 minutes. You want to run? Well, let's run for 15 minutes, then try some work, and then run for 10 minutes more. You want to run? Okay, let's run for 5 minutes really, really hard. Then we'll work for 15 minutes. And then the last 10 minutes, we can let you run as hard as you want again. As soon as you give a person some information that suggests that they will get a chance to do what is in them, they're immediately engaged. And on occasion, we tend to use sports as a way to discipline children, help them to understand structure. That's fine. But that's not the only way, because as we see, sometimes athletes are only accustomed to one way of being disciplined. And then they start using that on others. Yeah. And everybody else outside of them may not be into sports. Yeah. They may be into, social interaction.
When I was in high school, we'd have to run a mile if something happened. So now me running a mile is dreadful because it's like you're in trouble.
Yeah. It wasn't used to help me.
No.
It was a punishment.
It was a punishment.
Right. Yeah, and that's where the psychoeducation really is so important, because what you're always trying to do is, when you introduce something, you don't want to make it traumatic. You don't want to make it unattractive, because you might be introducing something that is very beneficial. Physical fitness is beneficial. Running is beneficial to the human body. But if you traumatize a person with running, that may lead to them never exercising again. I mean, I'm serious.
Right.
That may lead to them becoming obese, which could lead to them becoming diabetic, which could lead to them having a shorter lifestyle. And that's how you need to find a way to wrestle with or flush things out a little more, and not get so married to the way that you do things. Mm-hmm. Especially not in the year 2014, when we have so many brilliant minds on the planet.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
This is ESPN LA. Kem, if you're in a relationship and you have, children, and you guys totally disagree on how to discipline your child, how to engage your child in different activities, and the children see this kind of conflict. Yeah. What do you do in your therapy to help the partners come to an agreement?
Well, what I do first is gather information from each person about what they consider valid ways of raising the child. And then we try to find a way to get them to invest in creating a version that combines the two, which is creating your own language. For instance, I may have a certain set of disciplinary techniques that I want to use on my daughter, and my wife may totally disagree. Before engaging in it, we should probably have a discussion prior to that event happening. Yeah? So that we can at least have a little more time to process the intervention before we actually argue in front of her. And I think that's where we fall short. We could have a conversation over coffee or tea. Honey, let's go to, a coffee house and talk. I'm going to create a few scenarios. You tell me how you would respond to them. Let's say our daughter just wrote all over the walls. I want to whoop her butt right now to show her you don't destroy property. What do you think? Well, I don't think you should touch her, and if you do, I'm going to be pissed. Well, thank you for sharing that with me. So what would be the ideal way for us to deal with the fact that she destroyed property? Well, I think we should talk to her and give her 3 chances. Okay, so you're saying 3 chances, no touch. I'm saying touch. What's the compromise here? How about 2 chances and then a touch? Okay, so now 6 weeks later, just like clockwork, she writes all over the walls. We talk to her. She does it again. We talk to her. She does it again. My wife and I look at each other and say, okay, now it's time for the touch. But we're in agreement. Mm-hmm. So what the daughter sees is a unified family system that is able to contain her, to hold her, to keep her safe in a healthy way. And she doesn't even have to wrestle with the cognitive dilemma of understanding who am I supposed to be loyal to, because these are the two people that I love the most, and they're in conflict. There is no need for her to even deal with that. Now she can deal with, I've been taught a lesson about writing on walls.
Or a silk couch.
Someone is having a personal experience here. Would you like to share more?
Oh my gosh, yes. I was like, do not give him markers.
Right.
Then he went out and bought some more markers. Why'd you buy some more markers?
Now, did you guys talk about that in front of, or?
Yes, in front.
Oh,
yeah.
Strike one.
I know.
Yeah.
You need to come over to my place.
Well, you can fix that. It's still time.
I don't know. Marker.
Information. Like if I gave you all of this information as a radio host, who's a mother, and you don't go back and use any of it, then you didn't shift your cognitive triangle.
Yes, and I do. I need to do that. Adjust it rather quickly, because that silk gold couch, I don't know. It could go to the cleaners, I hear. What? I don't know. But then again, there's the thing where it's like, it's just a thing.
Mm-hmm. I'm glad you said that, because if we really step back and say, well, I have a toddler in my home.
Right.
Would it be a good idea to buy a silk couch?
This was before we even thought of having kids, you know?
Okay. I have a toddler in the home. Maybe we should cover that puppy up.
You know?
Yeah, I mean, that's just, there's always ways to, like, wrestle with it a little more. I think we wrestle with things a little. We need to wrestle more. Mm-hmm. Yeah, we give up and come to a conclusion so quickly. And as a result, we create laws. We create ways of dealing with our children. We create ways of socializing. We create a criteria to develop friendships. And I think we need to just step back a bit, slow it down, and really, really take the information in. Not suggest that you're taking it in. Really take it in. Mm-hmm. So that you can come up with some alternative ways. Now, alternative ways doesn't mean you are going to totally abandon your old ways. It just really gives you more to pull from. It's been really interesting to watch how, when they talk about Ray Rice and domestic violence, how they talk about it. I don't necessarily have any disagreements with any of the ways that people are talking about it, but I wish the narrative would at least be, well, these two individuals have been together for a while, and they agreed without saying they agreed to a certain way of interacting. How were they interacting a year ago? How do they interact when they're in social settings and one gets frustrated? Because that wasn't the first time that happened.
Oh, yeah, no.
That may have been the first time that it got to that level. But when human beings interact like that, you have to ask yourself, what did they both bring to the table, the emotional table, to get both of them to say, yeah, I think I can get into a relationship with you, and there is going to be these acts that others would perceive as unhelpful, but I am in. What led to them making that decision? I think that's a conversation worthy of discussion.
Oh, absolutely. And it also goes to, how, like you were saying, how people were raised. If they're, for instance, I've seen people that were in unhealthy relationships before, or raised in unhealthy relationships where that is what they know.
Yeah.
A caretaker, someone that is trying to help an addict, mm-hmm. that is trying to stop them from doing something all the time. That's their role. Mm-hmm. What is your role in your family? What is your role in your relationship? Now, also brings to mind where a time where my boss was being really ill, man. I mean, it was like, I can't believe she's saying these things. It was abusive.
Like really just bringing it. Yeah.
And around the Ray Rice thing that came out, I was saying, if we were in a relationship together, there is no way that I would accept my boss saying those words to me or being as abusive if she was my boyfriend.
Right.
Why am I accepting this now?
Right. Well, a lot of it was rooted in security. My boss could impact my livelihood if I just engage in confronting her about fundamental respect. She could impact my entire world. Typically, there is a variable that the abused has been able to embrace to make them accept the abuse. One of them is security. Even though you may have the most valid position, if you can't find a way to create a better lifestyle, if this person or this system is not a part of your world, then you compromise your values. You police your tongue. In a relationship, you are empowered in a way that you're not when you're employed or when you're being under the boss structure. Mm-hmm. But when you create those freedoms where you can speak freely, it's much more liberating. I would encourage you the next time to use your creative words, because even a boss is not beyond reproach. Mm-hmm. The vocabulary is very, very powerful. You have to find a way to use it in a way that she or he can accept it and not be able to hide behind you being insubordinate. Because that's a technique that is used when it becomes employer to employee. As opposed to them saying, you know what, that's a very valid point, employee. I can't talk to you that way because I wouldn't like to be talked to that way. But, I mean, this takes a little courage, though.
Oh, yes, a lot of courage.
I'm a very courageous person.
Yes, you are.
And so one of the reasons I got into the clinical profession is because I recognized there weren't many African American males in it. And there were a lot of people making decisions about African American children who had absolutely no clue. And they were medicating children, and they were basically destroying families. And so I decided to go and learn as much about the clinical profession, and then make sure that I added my reality using the clinical language to these places where decisions are being made about families. And I could have easily been fearful of being attacked as insubordinate, mm-hmm. or disrespectful or angry African American man. I can't allow myself to have that narrative imposed upon me anymore. I'm concerned about preserving families. I'm concerned about representing the most powerless aspects of our society, children. And that's a non-negotiable issue for me. And if I clearly communicate to you using the appropriate terminology that you're wrong, then you have to wrestle with that, not me.
Mm-hmm. But there goes into the fact that being African American, or there was this woman who came on a couple weeks ago talking about how if you stand up for yourself as an African American woman in the workplace, mm-hmm. you're seen as the angry black woman. So a lot of women of color that go in don't try to be happy and smile because they don't want to be labeled like that, mm-hmm. or the angry black man, or.
You know, I guess I would wonder what's so important about a label. They labeled me. That doesn't mean that I label me that. Mm-hmm. I mean, you can label me angry black man all you want, but I'd label myself as compassionate African American man that's really advocating for my client population. I don't have to embrace every narrative that you put out there. And I would encourage African American women to recognize, number one, you have a right to be happy with the way that you communicate if you're following all ethical guidelines, all codes of conduct, and all professional ways of dealing with someone. And if someone tries to use that against you, then there are legal means you can take to deal with that. But do not allow yourself to be policed by energies that may be jealous, envious, or threatened by you, especially if your agenda item is to bring about the best possible product for your agency or workplace.
Amen.
Amen. Amen.
Kem, can you give me some top tips of ways we can communicate and partner with our families or kids in loving relationships and helping our community?
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the ways, first of all, is we need to be leery of passing judgment on others, because families are, in a sense, on their own island, and we may see a family interacting in a particular way in a grocery store, and we'll pass all of these judgments that may or may not be right. Mm-hmm. I think one of the first things we need to do from the perspective of families observing other families is...
mind our own business? No. Well, if we mind our own business, then things can go wrong.
No, look to learn. Look to learn. Meaning, if I'm watching an Asian American family interacting, before I say that it's wrong, why don't I go read an article on the Asian American family structure? And then reflect on whether or not that was wrong or totally appropriate for them. If I feel that an African American is doing something wrong, why don't I kind of do some research on where they came from and see how that informed their decisions? And now, in the midst of that, if they're doing something wrong, they have to do some work too to find out what is acceptable or not acceptable in today's society. So the learning is reciprocal. If it's just one family trying to work with family members, I think there are boundaries we have to set for our loved ones. Mm-hmm. This may be tough to hear, but I'm going to say it. You can spend time trying to help a person in your family, and they can kill you emotionally. You can spend time trying to rescue a person in your family who's a substance abuser, or a person who engages in domestic violence. And you'll think, I'm going to keep going with them because I have to love them and support them because they're my family members. But you're an individual also. And you have a heart, soul, and spirit, and the right to live. And if you allow yourself to be put in a place where your family members can kill you, I think you're doing a disservice to yourself. Thus, the need to set boundaries. After a while, you can't keep going back into an abusive situation. Otherwise, you're giving them permission to possibly engage in something lethal. After a while, you can't keep financing a substance abuser. Otherwise, you're giving them an opportunity to make you broke.
Yeah.
So even in families, love, some of the highest forms of love is to set boundaries and to say no. Especially when you have all of these behavioral indicators to inform your decision.
Right.
But just loving for the sake of love, it's skewed if you only love and never confront. If you only love and never set a boundary, because those are versions of love too, in my opinion. And let me preface everything that I've said today is this is Kem's point of view. This is my understanding of how to be a therapist, my understanding of how to be a clinician, my understanding of how to ensure a family continues to nurture themselves and grow. But I am not closed off to receiving other information from other people. But this is just where I am. So the views expressed come from me.
So do you think that the landscape for disciplining our family members, our children, and the growth that we have as a family unit is changing, capable of change?
Well, number one, it's been totally, monopolized by one culture. These are a lot of the ways that we are developing our parental styles as far as what's helpful and unhealthy is through Sigmund Freud, Piaget, Anna Freud, and all of these developmental psychologists and educators who happen to be European American. If we only keep trying to make African Americans, Persian Americans, gay and lesbian couples, and all of these other couples engage in parenting through one paradigm, we're missing 90% of the information on how to parent. So we need to open up the dialogue and again have those other populations be legitimate contributors to what healthy and helpful parenting and communication is.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Kem Saunders, licensed marriage and family therapist. If anybody wants to find out more about you or seek your services, how can we do that?
Well, I'm at Gateways Hospital, and I'm also at the Children's Bureau, and my work cell is 213-840-6130. Feel free to give me a call. I'm open. But those are the two places. I'm on Facebook. I don't use it much, but, you know, Kem Saunders is there. And I'm always open to trying to help communities who are in need, communities who have children that want to thrive and become, you know, their best selves. So that's how you can reach me.
Thank you. Kem Saunders, again, licensed marriage and family therapist. I'm Lafern Cusack, and this is The Experience. If you have any questions or comments about this show or have any show topics or ideas, feel free to log on to espnla.com and go to the radio page and shoot us an email or check me out on Twitter at Lafern Cusack. Thank you so much for joining me. Have a great week.